The syringe slipped from her hand and shattered against the concrete floor. Nurse Elsa Brandt stood frozen, staring at the prisoner strapped to the metal chair before her. The same man who, 3 years ago, had pulled her brother from a burning tank outside Bastogne. The same man who was now supposed to die by her injection in the next 60 seconds. The winter of 1945 pressed against the windows of Stalag 7A like a living thing, hungry and patient. Elsa had learned to move through the camp's infirmary with the mechanical precision of someone who had trained herself not to see the faces anymore, not to register the fear in their eyes or the way their bodies trembled when she approached. She was 24 years old and had already forgotten what it felt like to sleep without nightmares. Her assignment to the POW camp had come through official channels 6 months earlier, shortly after the Reich began consolidating medical personnel away from the collapsing Eastern Front. The letter had been brief. Report to Stalag 7A. Medical support for enemy prisoners. Service to the fatherland. She'd packed her few belongings in silence while her mother wept in the kitchen, knowing that jobs like these, tending to prisoners deep in Bavaria, were where the Reich sent women they wanted to hide from the world. The camp sprawled across a frozen valley like a scar on the earth. 20-foot fences topped with spirals of barbed wire, guard towers every 100 meters, searchlights cutting through the darkness like mechanical eyes. Inside, 2,000 Allied prisoners, mostly American and British, existed in a state of suspended dying. Not dead, but not quite alive either. The barracks leaked. The food was mostly water pretending to be soup. Men coughed blood into their hands and tried to hide it because sickness meant selection, and selection meant the medical block, and the medical block meant Oberfuhrer Krebs. Elsa had met Krebs her first day. He was a man built from angles, sharp jaw, sharper eyes, a voice like a knife drawn slowly across a whetstone. He'd walked her through the infirmary with his hands clasped behind his back, explaining the philosophy of their work. These are not patients, Fräulein Brandt. They are strategic resources. We keep them functional enough to work, nothing more. Sentiment is treason. Mercy is weakness. Do you understand? She'd nodded, her nursing diploma feeling like a lie in her pocket. The first month, she'd vomited after every shift. The second month, she stopped eating. By the third month, she'd learned the trick. You separate yourself from your hands. Your hands clean wounds, distribute the meager medical supplies, hold down prisoners while Krebs conducted his examinations. But you, the real you go somewhere else. You become a ghost haunting your own body. Then came February 14th. And everything she'd carefully constructed began to crack. She'd been inventorying bandages in the supply room when Krebs appeared in the doorway with 2 guards dragging a prisoner between them. The man was barely conscious, his uniform torn and caked with frozen mud. One of his eyes was swollen shut, and blood dripped from a gash across his forehead, leaving a trail of red drops on the concrete. "American pilot," Krebs announced, his voice carrying that particular pleasure he got from interesting cases. "Shot down 3 days ago near Munich. The Gestapo finished their interrogation this morning. Now we finish ours." He gestured to the medical chair in the center of the room, a monstrosity of leather straps and metal that looked more like an instrument of torture than healing. "Strap him in. I want to test the new phenol injection. Quick death, very efficient. The Reich is interested in streamlining certain processes." The guards dumped the pilot into the chair, and Elsa moved forward mechanically, her ghost self taking over, while the real her retreated deep inside. She began fastening the restraints, her fingers working the buckles with practiced efficiency. Left wrist, right wrist. The pilot didn't resist. He barely seemed aware of what was happening. Her hand moved to secure the chest strap, and that's when she saw it. A tattoo on his inner forearm, partially obscured by dirt and blood. Not military, personal. A small compass rose with initials in the center. EB, plus MB. Her fingers stopped. She looked up at the pilot's face, really looked for the first time since the guards had brought him in. Even through the swelling and bruises, even through the blood and 3 years of war, she recognized the shape of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead. Michael? The word escaped before she could stop it. The pilot's good eye flickered open, confused, trying to focus. Michael Brennan? Something shifted in his expression. A frown. His lips moved, forming words that barely qualified as sound. Who? Behind her, Krebs's voice cut through the moment like a blade. You know this prisoner? Elsa's mind went blank with terror. Knowing a prisoner's name? Speaking to them like a person? These were violations that could mean immediate reassignment, or worse. But the truth was already spilling out, unstoppable as blood from a severed artery. My brother, she heard herself say. This man saved my brother's life. The room went silent except for the hiss of steam pipes and someone coughing in a distant barrack. Krebs stepped closer, his boots clicking against concrete. Explain. Now. The memory came back in fragments, sharp and painful. Christmas 1941. Her brother Hans, barely 18, writing letters home from France about his panzer unit, about the cold and the boredom, and how war was nothing like the propaganda reels. Then the telegram, wounded in action, recovering in field hospital. When Hans finally came home 6 months later, he was different, quieter. He had refused to talk about what happened until one night, drunk on their father's schnapps, the story poured out of him. His tank had been hit during a skirmish outside a village whose name he couldn't remember or wouldn't say. Fire everywhere, his commander already dead, the escape hatch jammed. Hans trapped inside with flames eating through the crew compartment, metal turning into a forge, the smell of his own skin beginning to burn. Then hands, American hands pulling at the hatch from the outside. An enemy soldier who'd crossed 20 meters of open ground under machine gun fire to drag Hans out of the inferno. A man who'd carried him to cover, used his own first aid kit to rab the burns, then disappeared back into the chaos of the battle. Hans had caught only a glimpse of his face. Young, scared, a sergeant's stripes. And later, when the German medics found Hans unconscious behind a destroyed half-track, he'd been clutching something. An American dog tag, pressed into his palm like a secret message. SGT Michael J. Brennan. O positive. Catholic. He gave me his blood type tag, Hans had whispered that night, drunk and crying. So our medics would know, so they could save me. What kind of enemy does that? Now enemy! Sat strapped to a chair in front of her, about to die by her hand. Krebs listened to her explanation with his head tilted, like a crow examining something potentially edible. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, and Elsa felt her blood turn to ice. How extraordinary, he said softly. The American who saved a German life now receives German mercy in return. Poetic, wouldn't you say? He gestured to the syringe on the tray beside her. Give him the injection, Fräulein Brandt. Let's see if your gratitude translates to a steady hand. Sir, that's an order. Or would you prefer I send a report to Berlin about a nurse who fraternizes with enemy prisoners, who shows personal interest in their survival? We have labor camps in Poland that desperately need medical staff. I'm told the working conditions are challenging. Elsa understood. This was a test. Refuse, and she'd be shipped east to one of the camps everyone whispered about, the ones where the transports arrived full and left empty, where smoke rose from chimneys day and night. But comply, and she'd become the thing she'd been pretending not to be, an executioner in a nurse's uniform. Her hand trembled as she reached for the syringe. Phenol. Injected directly into the bloodstream, it would stop his heart in seconds. Quick, efficient, humane, by the standards of camps like this. She drew the liquid into the syringe, watching the clear poison fill the chamber. Behind her, Krebs breathed steadily, waiting. The guards shifted their weight, bored. Somewhere in the camp, someone was screaming. It was always someone screaming. Elsa approached the chair. Michael's eye tracked her movement, still dazed, still not fully understanding. She knelt beside him, bringing her face level with his, and pressed her thumb against the vein in his arm, feeling for the pulse. "I'm sorry," she whispered in English, a language she'd learned from her grandmother, a secret kept from everyone at the camp. Michael's eye suddenly focused. Sharp. Present. He looked at her face, then down at the tattoo on his arm, then back at her face. Understanding bloomed, slowly, like ink in water. "Little Elsa?" His voice was crushed gravel. "The girl from—"
Michael was quiet while she worked, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. "Why are you doing this? Really? It can't just be because I pulled your brother from a tank 3 years ago." Elsa's hands paused. She sat back on her heels, meeting his gaze. "When I arrived here, I told myself I was just following orders, that I was helping in my own way by treating the sick, by making things more bearable. But that's a lie. I've been complicit. I've stood by while Krebs—" her voice caught, "while he's done things that I'll never be able to forget. Things I'll never be able to forgive myself for not stopping. You couldn't have stopped him. No, but I can stop this. I can stop one death. Maybe that doesn't balance the scales. Maybe it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of this war. But it means something to me. It has to mean something." Silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of guards calling to each other across the compound, the eternal wind scraping against the buildings. Finally, Michael nodded. "Okay, tell me the plan." What Elsa didn't tell him was that the plan had a 90% chance of failure, that every step depended on split-second timing and incredible luck, that the punishment for what she was about to attempt would make a firing squad look merciful. But none of that mattered anymore. She'd already fallen. The only question now was whether she'd hit the ground alone. The next 3 days were agony stretched into an eternity. Elsa maintained her normal routine, morning rounds, assisting Krebs with examinations, distributing the pitiful medical supplies, while her mind counted down every hour, every minute. She'd forged documents listing Michael as prisoner 4782, diagnosed with advanced pneumonia, requiring transfer to the camp hospital at Stalag 9B for treatment. It was a thin fiction, but camp bureaucracy was so chaotic in those final months of the war that thin fictions often slipped through unchallenged. Michael she kept sedated in the isolation block, telling Friedrich and the other guards that the prisoner was dangerously ill, possibly contagious. Fear of disease did what orders never could. It kept people away. It kept them from looking too closely. The third night, the transfer convoy rolled into the camp just after dark. 3 trucks, 2 for general prisoner transport, 1 designated medical. Elsa watched from the infirmary window as prisoners were loaded into the vehicles, their faces blank with exhaustion and resignation. So many ghosts in human skin. When she waited until the guards were distracted with paperwork, then made her way to the isolation block one last time. Michael was awake but groggy from the sedatives, and she had to half-carry him out to where she'd hidden a gurney behind a storage shed. She strapped him down, covered him with a stained sheet, and began pushing toward the medical truck. Every step felt like walking through deep water. Every breath sounded too loud. Every shadow might hide someone who would stop her, question her, discover what she was doing. She was 20 feet from the truck when Krebs's voice cut through the darkness. "Fräulein Brandt, working late?" Elsa's blood turned to ice. She stopped, keeping her body between Krebs and the gurney, and turned with what she hoped looked like professional calm. "Oberfuhrer? Yes, we have 1 more patient for transport. Advanced pneumonia. Likely won't survive the journey, but regulations require we make the attempt." Krebs walked slowly, his footsteps crunching on frozen gravel. "How dedicated you are. Most nurses would have left this for the morning shift." He walked around her, circling the gurney like a predator. "Let me see the patient." "He's contagious, sir. I wouldn't—" "Let me see him." There was no choice. Elsa pulled back the sheet, revealing Michael's unconscious face. She'd smeared him with ash and water to make him look worse, had left the head wound unbandaged so it wept fresh blood. He looked like death warmed over, which was exactly the point. Krebs studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes flicked to Elsa, and she saw something there that made her stomach drop. Not suspicion, but certainty. The American pilot. The one from 3 days ago. The one you claim to know. "Sir, I can explain." "No need." Krebs stepped back, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "You've explained quite thoroughly already." "Guards." 2 soldiers materialized from the shadows, rifles raised. The game was over. Elsa had gambled everything, and lost. But then something impossible happened. The air raid sirens began to scream. For a moment, everyone froze, looking up at the sky as if they could see through the darkness to the Allied bombers that must be approaching. The sirens wailed like dying animals, and then the first explosions hit, not in the camp, but close enough that the ground shook and the lights flickered. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards ran for the anti-aircraft positions, prisoners dove for cover. The convoy trucks started their engines, desperate to move to safer positions. And in the confusion, Elsa did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the gurney and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move, had to find shelter, had to somehow use this chaos to save them both. Michael had woken at the sound of the sirens, and she felt his hand grip her arm as she pushed him through the compound. "The fence. Eastern side. I saw it when they brought me in. There's a gap where the truck convoys pass through." They ran through smoke and darkness, through crowds of panicked prisoners and distracted guards, through a world that had suddenly become too chaotic for anyone to care about one nurse and one dying prisoner. The explosions continued, getting closer, and Elsa realized these weren't precision strikes. This was carpet bombing, the kind that designed to obliterate everything in a target zone. They were going to die here. All of them, German and Allied alike, crushed under the weight of a war that had long since lost any meaning beyond mutual destruction. But then they were at the fence, and Michael was pulling himself off the gurney despite the sedatives, despite his wounds, despite everything. The convoy gap stood open, 10 feet of freedom between 2 guard towers, both now abandoned as their occupants fled toward bomb shelters. "Go," Elsa pushed him toward the opening. "Run! There's a forest about half a kilometer west, if you can reach it before the bombing stops." "What about you?" "I can't leave. They'll execute my family, my mother, my—" "Then they'll execute them anyway, once they realize you helped me escape." Michael grabbed her hand. "I saved your life. Now let me save yours, please." The ground shook with another explosion, closer this time. Flames rose from one of the barracks. Someone was screaming for a medic. The whole world was burning. Elsa looked back at the camp, at the infirmary where she'd tried to remain human, at the barracks full of dying men, at the life she'd known as she'd hated it. Then she looked at Michael, at this man who'd crossed enemy lines to save her brother, who'd suffered torture and starvation, and still managed to care whether she lived or died. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. They ran together into the darkness, leaving the sirens and the flames and the screaming behind them. The forest swallowed them whole, branches tearing at their clothes, roots trying to trip them in the darkness. Behind them, the bombing continued for another 20 minutes. 20 minutes of the earth shaking and the sky burning and the war chewing up everything in its path. When silence finally fell, they were 3 kilometers from the camp, collapsed in a drainage ditch, covered in mud and blood and sweat, breathing like drowning victims. "What now?" Elsa whispered. Michael laughed, a broken, exhausted sound that held no humor. "Now we survive, and then we figure out how to live with what we've done." They walked west for 6 days, moving only at night, hiding in barns and abandoned farmhouses during the day. Michael's wounds festered despite Elsa's attempts to treat them with stolen medical supplies. Her feet bled through her shoes. They ate raw potatoes and drank from streams, and tried not to think about what they had left behind or what waited ahead. On the 7th day, they encountered an Allied patrol near the Rhine. Michael, delirious from fever, shouted something in English about his unit, his serial number, his blood type. The soldiers surrounded them with weapons raised, barking questions, trying to determine if this was a trap. Elsa raised her hands and said the only thing she could think of. "I'm a nurse. He's a prisoner of war, and we both just want this war to end." They were separated immediately. Michael to a field hospital, Elsa to a detention center where she spent 3 months being interrogated by military intelligence officers who couldn't quite believe her story. Why would a German nurse risk everything to save an enemy pilot? What was her real mission? Who had sent her? The truth, that she had simply reached her limit, that she had chosen humanity over orders, and that she'd saved one life because she couldn't save any others, seemed too simple to be believable. Eventually, a letter arrived from Michael, now recovered, and returned to his unit. He'd written a full account